There is a moment in every major tournament cycle when the noise around the football threatens to overwhelm the football itself. It happened before Qatar in 2022, when the debates about host selection and human rights filled the air for months before a ball was kicked. It happened before South Africa in 2010, when doubts about infrastructure and safety dominated the conversation. And it's happening again now, with a question that has been circulating across Europe for the better part of 6 months. Could any European nation refuse to play in the United States? Could supporters make that choice themselves, even if their teams did not? And what does the very fact that this conversation happened tell us about the state of football's relationship with the world around it? The answer, as things stand, with the tournament now upon us, is that no European national team has withdrawn, and no major federation has officially committed to a boycott. Every qualifying nation from Europe is participating. But reducing the story to that single conclusion would miss almost everything that matters about it. Because the boycott debate that swept through Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and parts of Scandinavia over recent months was not a fringe movement. It was a genuine expression of concern from serious people, football administrators, politicians, supporters, and former players, about what it means for the World Cup to be hosted in the United States in this particular political moment. To understand how we arrived here, you need to go back to the beginning of this year. Following public assertions by the United States government in January 2026, European political and sporting figures began to openly discuss the possibility of a boycott, with calls for action emerging from the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. Greenland, an autonomous Danish territory and a NATO partner, had become the subject of sustained and unambiguous pressure from Washington. For many Europeans, that crossed a line that went beyond the ordinary friction of international politics. In Germany, the vice president of the National Football Federation publicly called for European nations to seriously consider withdrawing from the tournament, comparing the situation to the boycotts of the Olympic Games during the Cold War, and asking whether a line had already been crossed. That was not the statement of a fringe voice. This was a senior institutional figure within one of the most respected football federations in the world raising a formal question. He framed it carefully, not as a demand, but as a conversation that needed to happen. "I really wonder," he said, "when the time will be to think and talk about this concretely. For me, that time has definitely come." In the Netherlands, more than 150,000 people signed an online petition calling on the Dutch national team to withdraw from the tournament in protest at what signatories described as aggressive behavior toward other sovereign nations. 150,000 signatures. That is not a social media flash in the pan. That is a significant body of public opinion expressing a view in a country whose national team had qualified and was preparing to compete. The Dutch Football Association confirmed it was maintaining contact with its governing body, local embassies, and football authorities, including UEFA, while monitoring geopolitical developments carefully. That kind of language from a governing body, careful, measured, deliberately non-committal, tells its own story about how seriously the pressure was being taken. In the United Kingdom, members of Parliament raised the question in the House of Commons, urging the English, Scottish, and Welsh associations to consider withdrawal as a means of expressing European solidarity. In France, left-wing political figures urged a boycott if trade tariffs were imposed. Even Sepp Blatter, the former FIFA president, a man whose own relationship to the tournament's governance is deeply complicated, backed the idea of fans choosing to stay away, saying he could support that kind of action. What is striking about this list is not just its length, but its breadth. These were not people at the political fringes. They were elected officials, sports administrators, former players, legal scholars, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary supporters. And the reasons they cited went beyond Greenland. They included concerns about immigration enforcement, reports that federal agents might be present at or around match venues, travel bans affecting nationals of several participating countries, and a broader anxiety about the climate of welcome, or the lack of it, that international visitors might encounter. Reports circulated that immigration enforcement operations could take place at or around World Cup fixtures, and senior officials refused to rule this out when asked directly in public hearings. That single fact, or even the uncertainty around it, was enough to deter a meaningful number of international supporters from making the journey. For many fans, particularly those from countries whose nationals have faced heightened scrutiny when entering the United States, the question wasn't just whether they could attend, it was whether the experience of attending would be worth the risk. A Swiss legal expert with a long background in football governance distilled the sentiment into one blunt piece of advice. If fans considered everything that had been discussed, the only conclusion was to stay away from the United States. That may have been stated more forcefully than most would have put it, but the underlying concern was real and shared widely across different countries and different communities. Now here is where honesty becomes essential, because the story of the European boycott discussion is also a story about what didn't happen. The German Football Federation, after internal debate, ruled out a boycott. Its statement spoke of believing in the unifying power of sport and the global impact a World Cup can have, and concluded that the goal was to strengthen that positive force, not prevent it. The Dutch Football Association's president confirmed the Netherlands would not be withdrawing, despite what he acknowledged were threatening political signals from Washington. France's sports ministry stated there was no desire for a boycott. England, Spain, and the other major European nations did not endorse the calls. FIFA president Gianni Infantino responded to the growing noise by stating he was against both bans and boycotts, arguing they achieved nothing and fostered more division rather than less. He questioned the logic of applying standards to football that weren't being applied elsewhere in international relations. It was a characteristically political answer from a man who has navigated the relationship between football governance and geopolitics throughout his tenure at FIFA, and whose own position had already drawn scrutiny. Infantino had presented a FIFA Peace Prize to the American president at the World Cup draw ceremony in Washington, a decision that generated considerable criticism in European football circles and was seen by some as undermining FIFA's stated commitment to remaining above politics. That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire debate. FIFA has long insisted that football should remain separate from politics. It is the stated justification for everything from the exclusion of individual nations to the selection of host countries. And yet, the tournament has been embedded in politics at every level since its hosts were selected. The draw ceremony was held at a concert hall in Washington. The Peace Prize was awarded in the Oval Office. FIFA opened an office in a building closely associated with the American president. Each of those choices was a choice, and each choice made the argument that football exists above politics, a progressively more difficult one to sustain. What do you remember about football boycotts from your own experience of following the game? The 1980 Moscow Olympics, where dozens of nations stayed away in protest at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The 1984 Los Angeles Games, where the Soviet bloc responded in kind. Those boycotts are remembered now primarily for what they cost the athletes who were denied their chance to compete, and for the limited political impact they ultimately achieved. The sport moved on, the Cold War continued regardless, and the athletes who missed their moment never got it back. That history is important context for the current debate. Analysts who know the mechanics of both World Cups and boycotts have pointed out that the practical barriers to any national team withdrawing are enormous. FIFA can ban a federation from all international competition, including European championships, age group tournaments, and women's competitions. The financial cost alone would be significant. The sporting cost would be felt for years. Those are not theoretical threats. The governing body has used these powers before. And yet, the fact that the boycott discussion happened at all, that it gathered the signatures of 150,000 people in one country alone, that it reached the floor of a national parliament, that it prompted a senior German football administrator to ask publicly whether a threshold had been crossed, tells us something genuinely important. It tells us that a portion of European football's public and a portion of its official community felt like that something about the specific circumstances of 2026 warranted a different kind of response. Whether that feeling is right or wrong is a judgment each person makes for themselves. The players heading to North America this summer didn't choose the political context they're competing in. They've trained for 4 years, qualified through grueling campaigns, and are carrying the ambitions of their countries and their own professional careers into a tournament they've prepared their whole lives for. It would be a different kind of injustice to strip them from it because of decisions made at a level of governance entirely beyond their influence. But the supporters who signed those petitions, who chose not to book flights, who watched the political climate around the host nation and decided they didn't want to be part of it, their response deserves to be understood on its own terms too. They weren't irrational. They were applying a set of values to a situation and reaching a conclusion. The fact that those values didn't ultimately produce a team-level withdrawal doesn't mean the underlying concerns were without merit. The Swedish Football Association president, who confirmed his country's participation while making clear he did not share FIFA's enthusiasm for awarding a peace prize to a political leader, put it in terms that many across Europe would recognize. He acknowledged that football and politics often go hand in hand, while rejecting the idea that football's institutions should use the sport as a political tool. That is a fine distinction to draw. Whether the tournament's organizers have managed to stay on the right side of it is a question the next 6 weeks will continue to raise. What we know now is this. The European boycott calls were real, widely felt, and seriously debated. They were ultimately rejected by every national federation that faced them. The teams are going, football will be played. And the conversation about what the World Cup owes its supporters, about who this tournament is really for, and whether football's governing institutions reflect or contradict the values of the people who love the game, will continue long after the trophy has been lifted in New Jersey on the 19th of July. I'd be genuinely interested to know what you make of it. Not just the question of whether a boycott would have been the right call, but the broader question underneath it. When the world around the World Cup changes significantly, does football have a responsibility to respond? Or does the game's greatest value lie precisely in its refusal to be absorbed into the disputes of the moment? If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you'd think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage, and let me know your view in the comments. I read every one. The World Cup has always existed at the intersection of sport and the world that surrounds it. In 2026, that intersection is rarely felt more contested. Perhaps that is exactly why the football, when it finally arrives, will matter more than ever.